Hi folks, it's Thinking Slow here. I wanted to do an update to the last video we did on Ukraine, which basically sets out the fact that there's, or at least there should be, two positions in the conflict there at the moment, because until I think somebody starts recognizing that there is a Russian point of view and addressing that in some way, it's probably going to be more difficult to put a stop to this dreadful conflict that's killing a lot of innocent people in Ukraine at the moment. And the only thing we've seen from Western politicians and media is some kind of campaign of punishment of Russia and screaming for some things are becoming completely ludicrous, firing conductors of orchestras because they won't denounce Putin. It's become completely deranged, and it's a total refusal to even acknowledge that there's a Russian side to this conflict. And this is like all conflicts, but this one in particular is extremely complicated. A lot of bad blood, a lot of long history that's too long to go into now. But that has to be to some extent acknowledged to achieve a negotiated, at least standstill. And judging by what we're seeing at the moment, we're actually wondering whether the West has any interest in negotiating a standstill or whether they actually want this conflict. So we're going to go through the two sides of the story here and focusing a little bit on the Russian side. And we're going to do this while we still can, because censorship on both sides now is getting quite extreme, and probably within a number of days doing this explanation won't be possible. So this is the opening slide that we had on the last video. We've added some more, I think, important research into this, but you know what we're told on the right hand side, the mainstream media narrative, that a country's right to choose its own allegiances and alliances is sacrosanct and cannot be altered or changed in any circumstances. The other thing we're often told is Putin is basically irrational, drunk on power, and the third point is he essentially wants to recreate the Soviet Union and adding in parts of Eastern Europe as well. So the Russian perspective is NATO is essentially an aggressive organization. They don't want it on its literally on its doorstep, on its borders. They feel that was been an agreed position that's been breached. They also feel that diplomatic efforts, which have been going on a long time, at least since 2008, so sort of 14 years, have basically been exhausted, and ultimately they see having NATO and its bases and American activity in the sort of biological laboratories, having all that stuff on Russia's border means that they can never be secure, and for them it's an existential threat. And I'm going to focus on the left hand side because the right hand side we get 24/7 basically. So starting with the I think the main item is the sort of madness of Putin. One of the things he's accused of course, is wanting to recreate an empire and expanding into Eastern Europe. Now, I don't know what kind of sort of doublethink you need to look at this map and decide that it's Russia that's trying to create an empire, where it's clearly NATO moving eastwards up to Russia is the expansion of the empire. That is the empire creation. And we'll go into how irrational and Putin really is, but it's also obvious from this map that NATO is blocking in Russia from every single direction. And the advance into Ukraine is a massive advance with, I don't remember the number, but it's over 1,000 kilometers of shared border, and there's nothing insane about being very much against this. And in fact, as I'll show, everybody understands that Russia would react very badly to this eastward expansion, and we'll also go into what the Secretary General of NATO said about that, where he would not compromise. So it's no secret that Russia would react badly to eastward expansion of NATO, especially Ukraine. And these are very, very senior Western foreign policy experts who for years and years, all the way back to 1996, have been warning that this is not a good idea. And these are, incredibly senior people, former Prime Minister of Australia, former Defense Secretary of the US Ambassador, professors. This is really the top foreign policy experts around, and all of them have said this eastward expansion of NATO is very, very dangerous. So in that sense, Putin's reaction, rather than being irrational, was and is 100% predictable. And I think a lot of people now have watched Professor Mearsheimer's talk. I can see that the count on that going up a couple of million a day, which is great because that really sets out the case on the sort of ethnic diversity of Ukraine and many other historical issues. It's a brilliant video, and it's definitely worth watching if you want to understand what's going on. But anyway, the bottom line here is that all of these very senior Western foreign policy figures understood clearly that too much eastern expansion of NATO was going to cause a major ruption. So this is perhaps one of the most interesting documents in those files. This is a leaked cable from WikiLeaks from 2008, which is from the US ambassador reporting back what does Russia's impression of NATO expansion before the famous 2008 announcement that Ukraine and Georgia would be offered membership. And without reading the whole cable, this bottom piece is important. It says, from a strategic policy considerations, also underlying strong opposition, that's from Russia, to NATO membership for Ukraine and Georgia. In Ukraine, these include fears that the issue could potentially split the country in two, leading to violence or even, some claim, civil war, which would force Russia to decide whether to intervene. Now, as Professor Mearsheimer made clear, a large part of Ukraine is ethnic Russian, so they obviously, reasonably obviously, would not support NATO membership, and that's been borne out by various surveys that have been done in Ukraine. So clearly forcing the issue as such would lead or could lead to a split in the country, and as this says, potentially civil war. Now that's exactly what's happened, and of course Russia has been drawn into that because of the large number of ethnic Russians in eastern Ukraine. There's an article we'll go into a bit in Lou Rockwell that asks whether this actually wasn't a deliberate idea to suck Russia into this conflict, but that's a maybe. In any event, the important thing from this cable is people understood in 2008 what the consequences would be. This is real politic, this is what would happen in reality, and everybody really understood that this was a very likely outcome, and of course this is what has happened. And here's a very specific instance of one of those warnings, which is a long and fascinating interview with Sir Roderick Lyne, British ambassador to Russia. He makes clear that the 2008 Bucharest summit was a mess. He calls it a mistake. And in red I've put here what he said: if you want to start a war with Russia, that's the best way of doing it. Crystal clear analysis. Now, importantly, in that essay, and it's linked, or in the interview, it's linked below, he is not a fan of Russia, and he identifies the sort of lack of respect for law, corruption, brutality inside Russia. So saying this, that if you expand NATO into Ukraine, does not mean you support Russia. It means you just recognize what is an obvious reality. And he made that comment in December 2020. Now you've got to remember, we're going back to all those dates, 2008, 2020. All this time, the Secretary General of NATO is ignoring all this and pressing ahead anyway. And I'll go through what he actually said. And this is his comments in December 2021. We will not compromise on the fact that NATO has a partnership agreement with Ukraine, which is important for us and Ukraine. Now, here he is in the background. He is also an ex-director of Gavi, the Gates-funded Alliance on Vaccination and Immunization. So he's very much a globalist. He's also very much into the UN Sustainable Development Goals. But this kind of language, you have to remember that this is on the top of all those warnings going all the way back. As I said, there was the 2020 interview, the 2008 cable to the US, and then this goes back all the way to 1996. Extraordinarily senior people in foreign policy recognizing this is a problem for Russia. Now, again, without arguing the rights and wrongs, they knew this was problematic and there would probably be a reaction. And Jens Stoltenberg's language, we will not compromise. Okay, so if you're Russian, you think, okay, well, in that case, we'll have to find another way, essentially. And then I've seen this in lockdown, essentially, where when lockdown happened, the World Economic Forum came out and started printing a lot of fluffy articles about how good lockdown was in terms of climate change, where you suddenly start to think, well, actually, was that an agenda to actually get lockdown in place? And this is the same situation, I think, where once this war started, important globalists come out calling for regime change in Russia. Globalists from the Trilateral Commission, and in this case, Lindsey Graham, a Bilderberg attendee. And you have to sort of wonder whether this isn't the real agenda, essentially. This has been an agenda boiling away in the background that has not been said out loud, but now it is very clearly being said out loud. We want regime change in Russia. And actually we'll go in a little bit to the money side of this, but the oligarchs who have been pushed out of Russia are quite closely aligned with some of the interest groups pushing for this conflict, basically. So this could be the real agenda. Not fighting democracy for democracy in Ukraine, but actually orchestrating a regime change in Russia. So I think ultimately you're looking at a clash of value systems between this sort of unified one world government and President Putin, who has a much more conservative, with a small c, outlook. Now the one world government movement basically is reflected in this quote from Brock Chisholm, and this is not a direct inverted commas quote, it's a summary of things that he said, but he basically said, to achieve world government, it is necessary to remove from the minds of men their individualism, loyalty to family traditions, national patriotism, and religious dogmas. Now, that's going on all the time now. The sort of nation state is being undermined, religion is under attack, patriotism now is seen as being something very negative, history is being revised and destroyed. So, we are heading in this in this direction, I believe, to facilitate one world government, and that's happening everywhere now. There's all sorts of developments now with the World Health Organization that are taking more and more sovereignty away. This is a real process that's going on now. Now, Putin made a keynote speech in October 2021 where he said very clearly, actually this has already disappeared from YouTube, which is interesting, but he said quite clearly, we've been through Marxism, we don't want this kind of neo-Marxist agenda. We believe in family values, we believe in religion, we believe in the nation state. He's espousing some traditional conservative small c values. Now, this, as I said before in this, the administration government of Putin is very far from perfect, but this element does exist. It is sort of nation state built and family values and religion. And that puts them in direct conflict with the globalists who want one size fits all. They want policy making done at a UN level where ordinary people have no influence, and they want sort of cookie cutter solutions like net zero just imposed on all global populations. And as far as I can see, Putin is not playing that game, and that's another reason why they dislike him very strongly and they want him removed, in my view. And just a word on solutions, but the last thing also, if you do a little bit of digging on this hero president, you find even in the quite biased assessments of Freedom House, they acknowledge that actually President Zelensky has been removing important reformers from the government and putting in people with selected interests. I can only speculate what that means. I have a reasonable idea what it really means, but I don't want to say. And of course, he has all these offshore companies which have not been previously declared, and he's linked into the Pandora Papers. So, you know, again, the media portrayal of the hero is a long way from the reality. And if you look at anything to do with Ukraine, it's not a pretty picture. Certain things he certainly tried to improve and has improved, but it's not a black and white good guys versus bad guys narrative that you're fed. So just rounding up, basically, there is a Russian side to this story, and until that's taken into account, it's going to be difficult to get a solution. And everything that the West is doing now is to avoid getting a solution. The only focus now is on punishing Russia and making arrangements for regime change, which is just going to drag this out longer and deeper, and then it could potentially spiral completely out of control, which is happening at the moment. And there's nobody really facilitating any kind of dialogue or ceasefires. And I actually know friends of friends who are in Kiev, and you know, real innocent people are having their lives decimated and losing their lives. And I think people have pointed out on Twitter that no conflict in the past has there been so little effort invested in getting it resolved, at least a temporary ceasefire. The only thing that's happening now is fueling anti-Russian hatred and a witch hunt, no interest in actually any kind of solutions. So, you know, there really are only more or less 4 solutions that we'll look at on another video. But it's to keep a neutral Ukraine out of NATO, which is what all of those commentators all the way back to 1996 suggested. Split Ukraine east from west with a hard border, which would be in many ways a nightmare. Or the other one is to align Ukraine with NATO, which a lot of people in the east, the ethnic Russians, won't like, and to basically displace those people. And in many ways, I think that is what has been going on the last few years. There have been up to 55,000 deaths and injuries in East Ukraine since 2014. And someone raised that as a question in a talk show and was asked to leave the room. That is how little the West wants to address the realities of that fighting in East Ukraine. And the 55,000 figure is the upper limit from the United Nations, and it includes East and West. But in the last few years, 80% of the deaths have been in East Ukraine, in those autonomous republics of Donetsk and Luhansk. And it's a valid Russian issue that is never addressed. It's like it never happened and doesn't exist, and that has to be acknowledged as a fact. It is a fact, and that's a problem for them. But my feeling is that this has been a sort of slow motion cleansing of the ethnic Russians, because life has been made very difficult for them. And you know, that could go in with full NATO alignment, because you basically have pushed out one way and another a large minority that didn't agree with that position. And now the final solution is regime change in Russia to put someone more palatable in there. And based on those comments from Trilateral Commission member Mr. Bildt and Bilderberg attendee Lindsey Graham, that looks like what the deep state actually wants now, or I think they've wanted it all along, but they've been sort of nervous about saying that. And then that ties back into that cable from 2008, where that series of events was clear that forcing Ukraine into NATO would create a problem in the east, which could lead to division and civil war, which would then put Russia in a sort of fork in the road to intervene or not to intervene. So you have to wonder whether that wasn't actually an intended sequence of events to get to where we are now, and that's certainly been suggested in a Lou Rockwell article, that this was all quite deliberate. So just finishing up then, I put on the website an important list of dates. You can't see them here, but it is important to get a timeline of who did what when, because that's the only way to sort of understand two points of view. There's been a lot of very, very bad history on both sides, but I think it's important to see that there is a Russian side, going back certainly to 1991. The question of NATO expansion, there is no question that senior Western leaders repeated over and over again that NATO would not expand eastwards. That's a fact. There's archives are open on that. You can read all kinds of cables, diplomatic cables, messages, minutes, confirming that over and over again. Those undertakings were given to President Gorbachev back then. So there's a link to the file if you want to see it. And here are some important articles, obviously not really in the mainstream, but there's one here about the empire building of America. This is the full interview with Sir Roderick Lyne that I'd definitely recommend looking at. I learned a lot personally from that. And then this is about the offshore companies of the president, and this is Professor Mearsheimer's talk. So I think that's it for today. I've tried to sort of add the Russian context into this, but the real issue is the solution, and what's happening now, this sort of Russia baiting, this sort of looking to new ways to punish Russia all the time. That's great, but it's not getting anywhere near a solution. And I'm certainly beginning to wonder whether that is because regime change is the ultimate aim, and people will tolerate innocent deaths inside Ukraine in order to basically undermine the position in Russia and make a regime change more likely. So that's it for today. I'm going to put up some more material in the coming days, again focusing on potential solutions. Thank you very much. Bye.